Welcome back to the Week 16 Waiver Wire Preview Show here at 4for4 Football. As always, I'm your host for the most accurate podcast, John Daigle, and we are here today to preview none other than the Week 16 Waiver Wire column, getting you ready for Week 16 and 17, likely the end of your fantasy playoff scenarios, including a dwindled down drop list, even though this time of year, you know who to drop. You know who you don't need anymore, wasting away at the end of your bench. Not to mention the end of roster top 10 catered for the backups we should stash, the contingency players we should roster for the next 2 games, since that's what matters the most. Before we begin, though, reminder, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Sleeper, one of the fastest growing customizable fantasy football platforms in the entire industry. And when I click on my team in the Sleeper app and I select that plus sign over the football helmet, I go to the waiver wire pickup of the week in Zack Moss. Are we worried about Zack Moss? Of course, because he's hashtag not good, as proven by being stuffed for 2 yards or less on 45% of his carries with the Colts so far this year. But with Jeff Saturday being one of the worst coaches in NFL history, we also know he's naturally going to lean on Zack Moss in place of Jonathan Taylor, who's not expected to return at any point this year with his ankle sprain, because that's exactly what Saturday did most recently against the Vikings, and allowing Moss to outsnap 53-25, outtouch 24-14, and most importantly, for anyone that might be worried about game script for Deion Jackson, Moss still ran more routes than Deion Jackson, 14-9 in that game off the bench as well. Indianapolis quietly being projected as 3.5-point home dogs at Vegas Sportsbook against the Chargers Monday night also suggests this game might be closer than we think. We saw the Chargers already fail what was thought to be a blowout situation for them against the Titans defense, missing 7 starters this past game. And that scenario would potentially allow Moss to benefit against this front seven being plowed through for a league high 5.4 yards per carry. So if you are desperate for a running back to start in the fantasy playoffs due to injuries, Zack Moss is there for you. Sleeper's sleeper of the week for deeper leagues, though, is none other than Rashid Shaheed, because to the naked eye, Shaheed's 68-yard touchdown from Taysom Hill on Sunday is a blip on the radar. But everyone who's been paying attention knows in Shaheed's last 2 games, he's played the most snaps, 66%, among all of the Saints wide receivers, Chris Olave included. He has the same route rate as Chris Olave in these 2 games. And Shaheed in that time also, 17.3% target share, 21.2 yards per target. So the depth you want for an explosive ceiling performance and volume with the target share. And of course, that combination has led to a wide receiver 32 and this past week, wide receiver 11 finish in fantasy. Some say Shaheed is only getting in Chris Olave's way, as the number 11 overall pick only has 1 top 36 finish, miserable, in his last 5 games, and thus remains a fringe flex option as well for Week 16. But I say it's Olave who's getting in Shaheed's way, since it's Shaheed who's finished as a top 36 receiver in these past 2 weeks, and that's who I'm looking to as a flex option instead for Week 16. Remember, head to sleeper.com or download the latest app to make those pickups today. If you came here looking for a replacement for Jalen Hurts, who is fully expected to miss the next 2 games for the Eagles, who already have the NFC locked up, then Brock Purdy is the next man up, because Washington, San Francisco's Week 16 opponent, has been above average team against quarterbacks for fantasy on the surface. But of course, we are adding context on this show. And if you peek under the hood, you'll notice this defense has benefited from playing Daniel Jones in back-to-back games, Marcus Mariota, who was benched, Davis Mills, who was benched, and Sam Ehlinger, who was benched in the last 2 months. Against Jalen Hurts and Kirk Cousins, the Commanders' only true test in this span, both finished as top 12 quarterbacks against them. Not only that, but if you make it out of Week 16 with Brock Purdy as your starter, you're then rewarded the friendliest matchup possible against the Raiders, who had allowed just over 17 points per game to quarterbacks in 8 games since their bye, before running into Mac Jones and whatever the hell he was trying to do in the NFL on Sunday. So rather than reaching for Gardner Minshew as the lowest hanging fruit, I'm pivoting to Brock Purdy, who is the more optimal starter in place of Jalen Hurts over the next 2 weeks. Let's revisit Chris Moore, because I know his results with 4 catches, 42 yards against the Chiefs this past week was not what we were all hoping for. But that's no reason to shy away now, because his opportunity in that game was still a team-high 32.1% target share. And that matches his opportunity the past 2 weeks with 36.4% of Houston's targets, 49% of the team's receiving yards, and 44% of their air yards in the last 2 games without Nico Collins, who's dealing with a groin injury and may not be ready to return since he has yet to practice the last 2 weeks, and Brandon Cooks, who we're not expecting to return at any point this year. More importantly, Chris Moore now gets an even better matchup against a Titans secondary, allowing league highs in yards per target and yards per game to receivers from the boundary. And that, of course, is where Moore has run 69% of his routes, a nice rate since week 14 these past 2 games in place of Cooks and Collins. So Moore is the player to absolutely add off waivers this week. And I would definitely add him over Jahan Dotson, because Dotson has turned his 56% catch rate and 23 receptions on the year into 6 touchdowns, which has made up 43.5% of his overall fantasy points this season. And yes, Dotson has soaked up 21.2% of Washington's targets over the last 2 games, but those are the only 2 games all year. He's also seen at least 20% of Washington's targets. And not only is Taylor Heineke not providing volume in failing to reach 30 pass attempts for this run-first Commanders offense in 5 of his last 6 games, the outlier being Washington's 70-minute tie against the Giants a couple of weeks ago, Heineke's also 31st in completion rate and 27th in yards per attempt under pressure since taking over as starter, which is important to note since now he gets the 49ers pass rush, who are about to bring the pain. So if we're not expecting volume and we're not expecting efficiency, Jahan Dotson, what would you say you do here? So I'm staying away from Dotson in shallower leagues and instead going for Rashid, Shaheed, and Chris Moore. Let's talk about some deep pickups before we get out of here, because Jaylen Warren is clearly back at full strength after the Steelers healthy scratched both Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland this past week. And we also know it from Warren's usage and recording 12 touches, which matched his previous season high that he initially set from the time before he was injured in week 11. And now we've seen, since their bye in week 9, the Steelers are actually calling the league's 7th highest run play rate. So there are more than enough carries now to go around for both Najee Harris and Warren in a 2-headed backfield against the Raiders, who have permitted 29 PPR points per game to enemy backfields since their week 6 bye. So Warren is viable in 12, 14-team leagues as early as week 16. With 5 touchdowns in his last 5 games. Yes, I understand you want to pick up Juwan Johnson. It is worrisome, though, that that's all he's doing and averaging a touchdown for every 3 receptions in that 5-game span. Meanwhile, some are worried about Chig Okonkwo's usage. Fantasy's tight end 9, tight end 2, and tight end 15 the past 3 weeks without Treylon Burks, because he's quote-unquote only run a route on 56% of dropbacks in that time, but his 18% target share in these 3 games is concerted usage because he's had plays called up for him, and he's being fed these targets with at least 5 targets in 4 consecutive games now. So if you're curious which to pick up and start, since both are widely available in leagues, and you look at this total of 31.5 points, not a misspeak, between the miserable Browns and the Andy Dalton Saints this week, that low-scoring environment makes the decision for us in ranking Okonkwo over Juwan Johnson as our best starter for week 16. And finally, Josh Kelley, just to note, did receive every touch in place to Austin Eckler once Eckler went out with injury this past game because Isaiah Spiller was healthy scratched and Kelley was the only running back available. But we all know to look at the history. And now we have 3 games the Chargers' last 3 games, with Isaiah Spiller active for 2 of them, and Kelley has still out-touched Isaiah Spiller 23-0 in that span. Thus, if you're stashing for Austin Eckler, just in case this injury he suffered proves to be a little more serious despite the negative test, or proves to linger around next week, Josh Kelley is the player to stash vehemently over Isaiah Spiller. You have start-sit questions, and I do not have the answers for you on a Monday. Imagine that. But John Paulson will be back for his start-sit Q&A for Week 16 this Friday, December 23rd at 12:20 p.m. Eastern. And all you have to do to get in and ask a question is subscribe to the 4for4 YouTube channel. Right now, if you're listening, like, subscribe, and be here Friday, 12:20 p.m. Eastern. John Paulson will be here to answer your questions. Also, catch our preview show on this very channel, free for all, Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, ahead of Week 16. And of course, until then, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.